started with the word, and jump back into worship at the end. But I don't have a welcome, and you don't need to clap for him, but I am going to pray for for the service. God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you for technology and the opportunity to hear a word from Tennessee this morning. I pray that you would open our hearts and open our ears so that we would hear this through what you are calling us to, that we would leave our week we had and the week to come at your feet and just take in what you are calling us to in this moment. And it's in your name. Amen and amen.
Good morning, Real Life Church. I trust that you've had a meaningful time of worship together this morning and are sensing the presence of the Lord. So let's go on with the word and let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for the time that we have today. We thank you for your blessings that rest upon us. We ask now that you would give us ears to hear, Father, what you would have to say to us, and the grace to follow through. Be glorified in all that we say and do. In Christ's name. What I want to talk to you about today is the importance of remembering what God has done in the past, so as to maintain our own faithfulness in the present. Our past mistakes, remembering our successes, and remembering God's faithfulness nevertheless. And that if we fail to do this, that is to say, if we fail to remember, then we leave ourselves vulnerable in the present. Hebrews chapter 2 says, therefore, we must pay greater attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. For if the message declared through angels proved valid in every transgression or disobedience received a just penalty, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? I want us to think of the word remember as a hyphenated word, remember. That is to say, to remember as opposed to being dismembered. To put back together. To remember is to make whole again. Think of the word recollect. Again, think of it as a hyphenated word, recollect. To recollect the things that have been scattered and put them in useful order again. Or the word recall, to call again, to call it again to mind, to make it real again. So to remember is to keep it together so that we do not drift away. And this is what our Bible does. Our Bible is good about remembering. The New Testament, you Bible students will know, quotes, or the New Testament quotes or alludes to the Old Testament over 300 times. The Christian faith is always moving forward, never stuck in the past, but nevertheless remembers the failures and the successes of the past and God's acts of power in the past, so as to maintain fidelity and confidence for today. Now, this practice of remembering began in the Old Testament itself. The writers of the Old Testament are always retelling or remembering something from the past so as to call the people of God to faithfulness again in the present. The writers will not let them forget that they were slaves in Egypt and God delivered them with a mighty hand. Now, this is what's happening in Psalm 78. We could do the whole message on Psalm 78, but we'll just refer to it. The psalmist recalls Israel's past mistakes and successes and how God disciplined them and then delivered them. And the psalmist critiques Israel for their signal mistake that led to more failure. They failed, the psalmist says, to remember God's power. Starting at verse 41 of that psalm, they tested God again and again, says the psalmist, and provoked the Holy One of Israel. They did not keep in mind his power. They failed to remember. So I've come by today by way of this video to tell you something that it's not like you don't already know, but to remind you of something that you don't need to forget. The God of the past is not a different God. He has not changed or grown old or weak or out of vogue, or he doesn't love us any less. He's no less attentive. The God of power in those old stories handed down to us is the same God that we worship and put our trust in today. Now, that doesn't mean that he will do everything today the same way he did it in the past. You forget about that. Don't put God in that box. He is, and he always has been, a God of surprise. I was lucky enough to grow up in a time when churches still had testimony services. So that dates me, right? Every week, the saints had a chance to share their victories and their hurts with the rest of the congregation. But I can remember eventually our pastor instructing the congregation, now, don't give praise to the devil, he would say, before the testimonies began. But translated, that means we don't want to hear about your present difficulty, only your victory. We don't want to hear about what you're going through right now and you don't have any resolution yet. Wait until you have resolution and then come to us with the victory report. We don't want to hear your complaint. But you see, honest testimony sometimes includes complaint. I mean, read the Psalms. A full 2/3 of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. Now that means something. The complaints, however, are translated into prayer. In 1 Peter 4:12, Peter says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." But if you don't have those, you don't hear those testimonies, even those testimonies that include complaint, then how do you not think it's strange if you've never heard others talk about their fiery ordeal and how God brought them through? But because I heard those testimonies as a kid, when I grew up, became an adult, I was not disillusioned when hard times came. I had learned from the testimony of the saints. I had learned from their stories. In times like these, it's good to remember that there have always been times like these. I think Paul Harvey is credited with saying that. And in times like these, we need to remember God's power. Stories. We need to tell the stories. Not only do we need to tell the biblical story, but we need to tell the biblical story and how that story intersects with our story. Jesus said, "You are my witnesses." Now, I'm not the first to make this point, but you don't give witness to doctrines. As important as doctrines are, we don't give witness to doctrines. You give witness to the things that you have seen and heard. And so we give witness to how that old story intersects with our story. I could tell you a story about how my family on my mother's side came to the Pentecostal charismatic tradition. Neither my grandmother or my grandfather were raised up that way. They got married very young, like they did back in those days, and they had just had their first baby. Sadly, their baby came down very ill, took him to the doctor. The doctor said, "There's nothing we can do for your child. He's going to die. The best thing you can do is go home and try to keep him comfortable until he passes." My grandmother and my grandfather were, of course, heartbroken. My grandfather leaves my grandmother at home. He goes to the drugstore to hopefully find something that might give the baby some comfort. And while he's there, he hears some music and singing. And so he investigates. And there, a room next to the drugstore, or a building next to the drugstore, he peeks in, and there's a congregation, a Pentecostal congregation, having a service. He steps in on the song service and when they finished singing their songs of praise and worship, the pastor steps up to the pulpit and says, "Saints, I believe there's somebody here that needs a miracle from God. And if you'll come to the front, we'll pray for you. And I believe God is going to give you a miracle." Well, my grandfather jumped to his feet and came down front, and he said, "That's me." He told him the story about the baby. And so the pastor told the saints, "We're going to pray for a dying baby." They did, and when the service was over, my grandfather went home. And by the time he got home, that little baby was already getting better. I can tell you that baby survived for another 80 some odd years. I just helped preach his funeral just a few months ago. He was well nigh 90 when he passed. Jesus said, "You're my witnesses." Again, we don't give witness to doctrines. We give witness to how the biblical story intersects with our story. And I got to tell you, there is nothing more powerful than your salvation story, your come to faith story, how you came to faith. The Spirit of God anoints the telling of that story and anoints the hearing. Not everyone will believe that story, but somebody will. So remember his power and tell about it. I was pastoring several years ago, and it was the first of the week, and I was trying to begin preparing a message for the coming Sunday. And I began to feel like I was hearing the voice of the Spirit to encourage me for my sermon to tell funny stories about bad things that had happened to me. I thought that's ridiculous, and I just ignored that. As the week went on, I just kept sensing that. It just stayed with me. I got to the end of the week, I still felt that. Finally, I just gave up, and I said, "Okay, I'll tell funny stories about bad things that have happened to me." Oh, okay. And I remembered a vacation that we had taken. We called it the vacation from hell. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong in that vacation. It was awful, but after the fact, we could laugh about it. So that's what I did. I got up to talk about that vacation. Funny stories about bad things that happened to me. The only thing is, I didn't know what the point of those stories were. I didn't know what was I going to do when I came to the end of that. I never got any direction about that. So when I stepped to the pulpit Sunday morning, it was a pure act of faith. I thought, if God doesn't do something, I'm going to look like a fool. I just stood up and did a comedy routine, So I just trusted that God was going to somehow, some way come through for me. And I told the stories about this terrible vacation, one bad thing after another. And I got to the last story. I got to the end of the last story, and I still had no idea how I was going to conclude this sermon or what the point of it was. And at the very last second, I remembered something I had forgotten. And I'd forgotten it because it wasn't something I wanted to remember. Something that happened on that vacation that we could never laugh about. During that vacation, at one point, my wife had to go to the emergency room, and they gave her some medication that you're not supposed to give to a pregnant woman. As it turns out, my wife was pregnant. Long story short, some weeks later, she lost a baby because of that medication. Now, what I realized in the middle of that sermon is that sitting in the congregation, visiting that morning from out of town, was a young married couple who earlier that week had just lost a baby. And as I told about how God ministered to us in the loss of a baby, I could see the tears running down the cheeks of that young wife. And all I could think was how good God is to have orchestrated that whole service just for that young couple, to minister to them in their pain. I could tell you stories, testimonies of God ministering to us and providing for us when we were poor Bible college students. One Thanksgiving, we couldn't afford to go home for Thanksgiving and be with family. And not only that, we couldn't even afford a turkey to have a turkey for Thanksgiving dinner. So we had to stay home. And not only did we stay home, but we don't get to have any turkey until there was a knock at the door. Of course, there's a knock at the door, right? And somebody was standing there, had 2 turkeys, and said, "Hey, would you like to have a turkey? In fact, would you like to have 2 turkeys?" We said, "Yes, we would love to have 2 turkeys." God not only provided for our Thanksgiving dinner, but we were able to provide then for another poor Bible school student for their Thanksgiving dinner. Another Bible college story, our car had broke down and I didn't have money to have it fixed. I didn't even have money to have it diagnosed. I didn't know what was wrong with the car. I had the hood up, I had my head under the hood, and I was praying, "God, please show me what's wrong with this car. I don't have money to fix it. I don't have money to have it fixed. I don't have money to have it diagnosed." And while I had my head under the hood, somebody tapped me on the shoulder, and I turned around. It was a big guy. He said, "What seems to be the problem?" I said, "Well, my car won't start." He said, "Well, tell me what happened." And I told him what happened. He reached over and he pointed down at one little part. He put his finger on it. He said, "Go replace that." I said, "Are you sure? I don't have money for mistakes." He said, "I'm 95% sure of that. Do it." And so I did. I replaced that, fixed the car for $40. As it turns out, that guy was a retired GM mechanic. Another time in Bible school, we didn't have money to pay our next tuition payment. I was walking across the parking lot, and another student stopped me and said, "Hey, Rod, I just wanted you to know that we want to make 1 or 2 of your tuition payments. If you'll come to the house, we're going to write you a check." I can tell you those stories, and you could probably tell me some stories just like that. So why don't you? Every now and then we need to tell those stories, because not only does someone else need to hear those stories, but we need to be reminded of them ourselves. I'm going to suggest that every now and then it's important for you to intentionally set aside devotional time just to rehearse in prayer to the Lord what He's done for me. I do it occasionally. I say, "Lord, I remember this time and you did this. I remember when this was impossible and you did that." We need to remember His power. I can remember having to make a major move in our ministry, and there were few people who understood. I was really sure about what we were doing, but it was discouraging that so many people just kind of weren't on board with us. And a man across the country calls me out of the blue and said, "I've heard about what you're doing, and I just want you to know that you're shooting your arrow straight." He didn't know I needed to hear that, but I did. And then a woman on her deathbed sent me word by way of her husband and said, "Tell Rod he's doing the right thing." Another woman sent me a letter and said, "Just wanted to let you know, I heard what you're doing, and it just feels right to me. Oh, and here's a check for $500. Then there was a time when I felt like God was leading us to go to seminary, and we had to move, and we had to find a house. The only thing is, I wasn't prepared to go to seminary. I wasn't prepared financially to make that move. And I was in town where the seminary was, and I felt impressed of the Lord to go into that seminary without an appointment and talk with the registrar. I felt a little silly, but I did. I walked in there, and I wasn't in there 5 minutes before he offered me a 90% scholarship. We had to move, and we had 4 children, and we had to find a house to live. Long story short, we had one day to find a house. God led us to a house that we never would have found. And we led us to a house, and not only led us to a house, but led us to a banker that understood our situation and was willing to give us a loan when I didn't even have a job. That was God's provision for us. I've told that story before, but I tell it now because I'm sure there's somebody out there listening to me now who the Spirit of God has been speaking to your heart and kind of maybe doing this, suggesting maybe you ought to maybe go out on a limb and do something. And you're wondering, am I foolish for trusting the Lord that way? I mean, exercise due diligence. I'm not your dad. I'm not telling you what to do. But exercise due diligence and let the Spirit of God confirm it before you do something crazy. But I just feel like somebody today needs a word of encouragement to say, the same God that provided in the past is the God that provides for you today. Now, one more seminary story. When we first went to seminary, we hadn't even moved in yet. We knew we were going, and we were supposed to visit. And I just felt in my spirit, Tammy and I were kind of taking a tour of the town. And I told Tammy, I said, I feel like we're supposed to give some money away. We are going to need God's provision in this little venture of ours. And I just feel like as an act of faith, we're supposed to give some money away. She says, I'm fine with that. Let's do it. She says, who do you want to give it to? I said, well, why don't we drive over to the family housing for the seminary, and let's just see if there's somebody out there. And we'll just believe that God will show us the right person. So I parked the car. I got out. I walked into the courtyard of family housing, and there was 1 or 2 people that just then stepped inside their apartment and closed the door. They were running from God's blessings. And so I kept walking, and I looked up, and there was a young woman coming out of her apartment. I said, excuse me, and I introduced myself. I told her what I was doing. So we're going to be new students. I felt like I'm supposed to give somebody some money. Would it be okay if I gave it to you? She said, yes, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, school started, the semester went on. I never saw that girl again, which was odd. I think we crossed paths at some point. But as it turns out, she wasn't a student. Her husband was a student. And toward the end of the semester, there was a special chapel service. And at the end of that chapel service, one of the students came over to me with that young woman that I had met and said to me, do you remember giving money to someone several weeks ago? And I said, well, yes, I do. He said, well, that was my wife. And there was his wife. And so then he explained that he was a student, she wasn't. They're both from the Ukraine. And he says, I just want to tell you something you don't know. He said, that very day, I had my car in the shop, and I didn't have money to fix it. And so I was walking home, praying. And I prayed, God, I don't have the money to fix my car, but I know you can provide me the money. He said, when I got home, my wife hand me that money. He said, I just wanted you to know how God used you to provide. Now, I want to tell you another story that some of you are close to. I want to tell you a story about when Dorothy Graham, my wife and your pastor's mother, was on her deathbed. We knew that she was going to pass, and my wife was privileged to be with her when she had some very special experiences, seeing visions, seeing people that had passed on. So on one of those occasions, I remember my wife telling me the story and how she just climbed up in bed with Dorothy. And Dorothy was describing all of the things that she was seeing. She talked about flowers and blooms that were very large. Dorothy loved flowers. And she said it looked like she was just reaching out, touching these flowers. And she would say, look how large they are. She began to name names. She said, well, there's so-and-so, and there's so-and-so, and there's so-and-so. And she was naming names of friends and family that had passed on years before. And Tammy recognized the names. And then she named the name. She goes, oh, well, there's so-and-so. It was a name Tammy didn't recognize. And Tammy's aunt was there in the room also. And she said, well, I don't know. Who was that? Tammy's aunt said, well, one of our sisters had a child that didn't live long. It died as a young baby. And she would never talk about that baby after it died. And so that's why you've never heard the name. But that's the name. That's who she's talking about. And so Tammy, being Tammy, says, well, Mom, do you see my baby? Now, something that we never really talked about very much, having to do with losing the baby. I told you that story, the vacation from hell. As it turns out, we lost twins. It appeared that it wasn't one, but two, and we lost twins. But it was too painful to talk about two. So usually when we talked about it, we only just talked about the baby. So when Tammy was talking to her mother, she said, Mom, do you see my baby anywhere? And she said, it looked like Mom was looking around, and she says, why, yes, I do. There he is. And then Dorothy says, oh my goodness. I'm like, what, Mom? She said, well, there's another one there, and it looks just like it. A good God to provide a source of healing and comfort for my wife for two tragedies at one. The loss of a child, loss of a mother, and God just good enough to minister in unexpected ways. And I guess that's what I want to say to you today, that God probably has a surprise for you. God is probably going to provide for somebody in ways that you weren't expecting, in ways that perhaps you may have even could have done without, but God in his goodness just wanted to prove his goodness to you. I like to say that if we fail to tell these old stories, if we fail to rehearse them, we leave ourselves vulnerable to the stories of a world that tell it a whole lot different, that do not include what comes from above, stories that do not include what cannot be seen. The stories that you and I tell include a God that transcends and at the same time is very near. A God who is above all and yet at the same time very present. The stories we tell includes things we're not expecting. The stories we tell include things that seem impossible. The stories that we tell are things that come seemingly of nothing. Because remember, the last time God found himself with a handful of nothing, he created everything that is. I'll close with this to remind you about the story of Job. You know Job, and how Job lived a righteous life, and yet all of these terrible things were happening to him, and his friends trying to say to him, it's just that you haven't lived a righteous life. And Job saying, I have lived a righteous life. I'm beginning to think that God isn't righteous. And Job demands an answer from God. And finally, God reveals himself after a long ordeal in the whirlwind and comes down and talks with Job. The thing about it is, God doesn't answer even one of Job's questions. God simply responds by reminding Job how powerful God is. And when God was done speaking, Job said, I'm going to lay my hand upon my mouth right now because I've said too much, but I have heard what I need to hear. Thank you, Father, for your goodness to us. This wasn't a sermon that's a great Bible study, but it is good theology. And I pray that you would minister to our hearts. I pray that you would remind us today and that we would remind ourselves of your power. And may we remember by calling those stories to mind and telling those stories to others that need to hear. Bless your people, we pray. In Christ's name.
Hello? Okay, cool. You guys can come up and get communion. The little bowl is right here. I had a communion message prepared, but now I got some crazy stories to tell, so we're switching it up. They're not crazy.